Waiving the appraisal contingency. In this highly competitive real estate market, your real estate agent may recommend that you waive the appraisal contingency in the hopes that your offer will be accepted. If this is something you are considering, here's a few tips to make note of so you understand really what this means. Today, I'm going deep on waiving the appraisal contingency, and I'm going to be reviewing financing numbers if the appraisal does in fact come in below your offer price. So first, what does it mean to waive the appraisal contingency? So depending on where you are in the country and your specific state, this may vary a little bit. But in Arizona, the Arizona purchase contract actually has an appraisal contingency built into it. And essentially it says that if the house doesn't appraise for the purchase price, then the buyer has 5 days after receipt of the appraised value to be able to cancel the contract and get their earnest money back. Now, there may be a variation in your state of an appraisal contingency. If there is one and you're considering waiving that appraisal contingency, then essentially what you're agreeing to is that if the house does in fact appraise for less than the purchase price, you're giving up your option of getting the contract canceled and getting your earnest money back for that reason. And so in this hot real estate market, we are seeing that quite often. And I'm not here to say that that's a good strategy or a bad strategy. Really, my point today is to be able to educate people who are considering waiving the appraisal contingency so you really understand the impact to the home loan and your funds to close. Now, what happens if the appraisal comes in below the purchase price that you've offered on a home? Before we dive into the numbers, I do think that it's important to work with a mortgage lender that can show you the what ifs prior to actually committing to waiving the appraisal contingency with an offer. And we do this quite often in our practice because I don't want there to be any surprises. I really am focused on making sure that our borrowers understand how the money is going to work if in fact they're waiving the appraisal contingencies. We use technology to be able to show side-by-side comparisons. So today we're going to look at the numbers and we're going to make some assumptions that the appraisal contingency was waived, the purchase contract was accepted, we have a valid purchase contract, and we have moved forward with the process. So now in this scenario, the appraisal's back. The purchase price was $650,000. but the house appraised at $600,000. So what we've done is we've put together a total cost analysis to really be able to show options. Everybody wants options, especially if the appraisal didn't come back at the purchase price, because essentially what it's going to mean is unless the borrower changes their down payment, they're going to go into closing with more money. And that might be perfectly okay, but if they don't have the money to go into closing with, our job as experienced mortgage lenders is to be able to give guidance and solutions to a scenario where the house appraises for less than the purchase price. So here's how that might look. Again, in this scenario, the price was $650,000. We're going to assume that the buyer waived the appraisal contingency and the house appraised at $600,000. So scenario one reflects best case that it would appraise at $650,000. That didn't happen, so that's off the table. But in that scenario, the buyer would have been going into closing with roughly $136,000. That includes the down payment and the closing cost. Scenario two shows the buyer, okay, now what happens with the $600,000 purchase price? You're gonna see the 20% down payment, plus now the buyer is having to cover the difference between the purchase price and the appraised value. This is really important because from a lending perspective, the home lender is going to lend on the lower of the purchase price or the appraised value. So in this scenario, the down payment, that 20% down, comes off of the $600,000 because that was the appraised value. Plus, the buyer would have to pay the difference between the appraised value and the purchase price. So in this scenario, that's an additional $50,000. This is why it's so important to really have a total cost analysis that can show you side by side the actual funds to close and what's happening with the home loan if in fact the house doesn't appraise at the purchase price. So scenario two, funds to close would now be about $176,000. You can see that the funds to close are now increasing because again, the house didn't appraise at the purchase price. But scenario 3 and scenario 4 is where we start to get into solutions. So scenario 3 says, okay, well, what can I do to reduce that cash to close requirement? Scenario 3 is showing a 15% down option, and that's bringing the total funds to close at about $146,000. And then scenario 4 is actually showing a 10% down option. And remember that 10% or 15% down option is going to be based on the appraised value of $600,000. And the buyer would still be going into closing with the additional funds to pay the difference between the appraised value and the purchase price. I know I sound like I'm repeating myself, but that is the hardest part of this equation. That's really, you got to kind of get your arms around so you understand what you're committing to. So as I mentioned previously, being able to understand how the numbers might come about early on in the process is the key to being an educated home buyer, especially if you're waiving the appraisal contingency or you're considering it. So ask your lender, okay, what would happen if the house doesn't appraise? Your realtor will probably have a fairly good idea of, in reality, based on the comparable sales, what they think that the house will appraise at. That's not an appraisal, but it would give some good insight so your lender can put together something like this to really be able to show you, okay, if your purchase price is $650, maybe they think the house will appraise at $620, $625, $615, whatever that is. So you go into the conversation and you go into the contract negotiations, whether you're going to waive the appraisal contingency or not. If you choose to, you have the information you need to be an empowered, educated buyer with no surprises. We don't want any surprises downstream. Now, one thing that is often confusing for home buyers is the difference between waiving the appraisal contingency in the actual purchase contract and a property inspection waiver from a lending standpoint. So there are home loans out there where the lender may in fact receive an appraisal waiver. It's called a property inspection waiver. And in that situation, you may not need to have an appraisal. Now, that generally only applies to Fannie Mae and or Freddie Mac conventional loans. So if you're using an FHA, a VA, or getting a jumbo loan, that property inspection waiver is not going to be an option for you. But if you are taking out a conventional loan, it very well could be an option. So what does that mean? Well, let's think it through. Let's say, based on our scenario, your purchase price is $650,000, and let's say that your real estate agent thinks maybe the house will appraise at $625,000, okay? Once the lender receives the purchase contract and they enter the address into the automated underwriting system, that system's going to come back and tell the lender whether an appraisal is needed or not. It's going to read the value of the price based on that area, as well as all of the loan factors that's going on, your down payment, your credit score, etc. And then it's going to come back and give a finding to the lender that says, yep, we're going to require an appraisal, or nope, an appraisal is not required. So in this scenario, if the appraisal is not required, then we're not going to have to get into the conversation of what if the house appraises for less, because in fact, you would not need to have an appraisal if you choose not to have one. Now, if a lender receives a property inspection waiver, it doesn't mean that you can't get an appraisal. It's just one of those things that you definitely want to be sure you're talking with the lender and that you really understand what a property inspection waiver is on a conventional loan and how that may benefit you, or the pros and cons of it. Like, I'm a big pros and cons person, so there's always scenarios where we got to just think it through and really talk about what if and how does this help, how does this not benefit you, etc. So really understanding a property inspection waiver from a home lending standpoint is different than waiving the appraisal contingency in the purchase contract when you're purchasing a house. If you receive value out of this video, please give it a like and please take a moment to subscribe. I truly have a passion for home loan education, and I want to make sure that people that are purchasing homes and using home loans, they just are empowered and educated to make the best decisions for themselves. So please join our community. If you have questions, don't hesitate to comment below. Until next time.